Good afternoon and welcome to the 2023 Within Health Summit. My name is Jamie Singletary and I am the Director of Clinical Brand Development for Within Health. And it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce Dr. Luana Marques for this conversation. Dr. Marques, will you be so gracious just to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And hi, everybody. Thank you for making time to be with us today. I'm Dr. Luana. I am a clinical psychologist at Harvard Medical School. I'm the author of Bold Move, a 3-step plan to transform anxiety into power. And I am really passionate about bringing science-driven strategies to all. And it's sort of a privilege to be with you all on World Mental Health Day. And so as we kick off, I just want to make sure that all of us here today are taking some time to really, take care of our brain and our emotional health and using strategies to be our best self, because it's every day that we need to take care of our brains.
Absolutely. And I think it's so fitting that the conference is starting on World Mental Health Day. And it would only be fair and fitting for us to acknowledge that we have so much pain and so many horrible things happening in our world right now. And just going off of what you just said in terms of taking care of ourselves, I think it's important that we make sure that we take care of ourselves and that we use self-care and that we keep our mental health in the forefront, which brings me to my first question for you. You often speak about becoming comfortable with discomfort. How did you learn to do this for yourself?
So I grew up in Brazil with a single mother and faced a lot of trauma and adversity early in my life. At one point, we had very little to eat, and it was really challenging. And about age 14, 15, I moved in from a smaller town to a bigger town in Brazil to live with my grandmother. And my brain became my worst enemy. I automatically predicted that people were going to make fun of me. They wouldn't want to talk to me. And so I started to really avoid people and anything that created the sense of discomfort. And, my grandmother actually caught on to my avoidance before I even knew what avoidance was. And one day invited me to go eat at the mall. And I remember vividly this day because I had never had Chinese food in my life. And she literally, as we got to the mall, got this food, she says, "Oh, let's talk to that person over there. It looks like they need some company." And I can't even tell you how scared I was. My stomach dropped. I was in full fight, flight, or freeze. And my grandmother just held steady. And, we approached, we talked to that person. And I don't remember how many of those outings we have, but it's my first vivid experience of what later, when I got to graduate school, I learned to be exposure therapy. The idea that when we are fearful, our brain wants to avoid, but there is an alternative. And the idea is to approach in a way that we can train our brains to be comfortably uncomfortable. And so that was sort of my first experience living a life that is out of my comfort zone. And I don't think I'd have the privilege to be here with you all had my grandmother not taught me those strategies early in life.
Well, we definitely have to shout out your grandmother. I'm so glad that she did that because you are such a pioneer in mental health. And it brings me to our next question. Can you tell us a little bit about your career path and what led you to where you are today? Also, when did you first know that you wanted to go into the world of psychology and psychiatry?
Gosh, so coming out of Brazil, I came as an exchange student to the US. I spoke no English. Then I came back for college, and I didn't think I was going to be a psychologist at all. In Brazil, there's two paths that one would take, especially I think if you want to be financially stable. At least that was the case when I was in Brazil. You either become a medical doctor or you become a lawyer. And so I came to the US to become a medical doctor. But in my first semester as an undergraduate, maybe second semester, I volunteered in a clinic that treated obsessive compulsive disorder. And I was a research assistant. I showed up and they hired me because I spoke Portuguese. They had a project in Portugal. I knew nothing about. So I like research psychology, but it was one of those pivot moments. I heard that you needed to do research. I went to this clinic, and I can't tell you guys, I fell in love with, exposure-based therapy for OCD, and they ran groups and support groups and the research behind it all. So that was when I got the bug for psychology. It was like, and probably when I look in retrospect, they were doing, and they were the type of therapy they were doing was what my grandmother did for me. And so it made so much sense in my brain that even I didn't have the vocabulary, I didn't have the science, but I knew that it worked for me and I could see it working for those patients. And so that's when I pivoted. I decided to become a psychologist. In fact, my grandmother is the person that gave me the permission, so to speak. I went home to Brazil and I said to her, I'm struggling. I'm trying to do the psychology thing versus this medical degree. And she said to me, well, why don't you take a psychology class, a biology class, and whatever it's easier, that's what you do. I said, well, that's easy then, because I get A in psychology and I get C's in biology. And she goes, then why are you struggling? Don't struggle. And I shared that in the context of something you asked about the arc of my career, and I'll get there in 2 seconds. But this idea that if we choose a career that aligns in the way that our brain thinks, we tend to thrive and do much better. And so I ended up pursuing a PhD in clinical psychology. And there's 3 arcs to my career. I finished my training here at Harvard Medical School at the Mass General Hospital. And early on, did a lot of randomized control trials, trying to understand how do we make CBT better? How do we, and I did across all disorders. So OCD, panic, trauma. You ask, and I got trained on it, eating disorders. And so then eventually got really frustrated. This is 2011, 12, when I went to our community clinics, and there are 2 things. First, that I wasn't working with people of color, and being a Latina woman, I wanted to serve those that were similar to me. And then our providers weren't getting training. So I did a lot of training in community organizations and really from the ivory towers to the streets. So starting to work with young men coming out of prison, single mothers, and really trying to implement CBT as strategies, not therapy anymore, but like, how do I train a paraprofessional who's working with the inner city youth, the strategy my grandma taught me, in a way that there's still science, but that they can deliver it with some level of fidelity. And so I did that for the next 10 years or so. And then currently I just published the book, Bold Move, and I'm really trying to bring this strategy to as many people as possible. So really shifting from not just the one-to-one organizations, but impact. How do we train people to live comfortably uncomfortable? And sorry to give you such a long-winded answer. I don't know how to summarize my career.
No, I love your answer, and I love the mention of the book. And so I do want to share that we actually will be giving your book to some lucky winners this afternoon. So we will be selecting some individuals that are attending this session, and they will get a copy of your book. And since you mentioned your book, and I see it sitting beautifully behind you, The Bold Move, I love the title. Could you share just a little bit about how you came up with the title and who this book is dedicated to, if anyone?
Yes, absolutely. Well, and as you mentioned, thank you. It was so kind of you guys to give some books away. And I'd love to hear from people in the chat. I see that we have about 30 of us here. So if there are questions or anything, please talk to us, because I would love to have more of a conversation with y'all. So I wrote Bold Move because the pandemic had just started. I had thought about writing a second book for a while, but I really had this feeling as a professional that I needed to do something else at scale, because my wait list was humongous. I couldn't help everyone. I was doing the first year of the pandemic, I did 200 webinars to just bring science out. Like it just felt like it wasn't enough. Mm-hmm. And so I also was in a point of my life that I felt it was necessary to share my story. So Bold Move is, I joke, is the best therapy I've had, because I got to sit and share with the world my struggles, having seen a lot of domestic violence in my home, and what does that do to my brain, and how did I overcome what I saw. I get to talk about the adversity as a Latina woman in a majority white system like Harvard. And of course, share lots of clinical cases and examples, but in a way that brings strategy. And so I really created the book in a way that anybody could use it. So it's for anyone. It is not a book about anxiety. It's really a book about avoidance. And so I talk a lot about the idea that whenever we feel anxious, like I did when I was 15, we avoid whatever that is. And I talk about different types of avoidance. And then I give 3 set of strategies for people to be able to really create their best bold life. And a bold life is not a life that you're sort of just like going for things. It's a life that is aligning values with action, is a line that you're taking steps every day to be your best self for yourself. So sometimes a bold move is a small little step, but for you feels like such a giant step.
That's right. So it sounds like in this book, you've really intertwined your own personal experiences, your own family dynamic, but also supplying those of us who may not have had some of those experiences with skills and ways to apply them to the things that we may be going through.
That's absolutely right. It is really, there is examples about dating. There's examples about CEOs. There's examples about people coming out of jail. There's examples of, my mom struggling. And so it's really designed to help people no matter where they are.
I love that. It reminds me, when you were talking, reminds me of that commercial. I'm probably aging myself, but there was a commercial about a book, and they would always say in the commercial, you got to buy the book. You got to get the book. Well, luckily for our attendees, some of them are going to get the book. So when you speak about psychological avoidance and why and where is it most likely to surface when someone is avoiding something psychologically, where does that come from?
So I define psychological avoidance as anything that we do that has the function of making us feel better fast. So it is really not about what you do, it's the why behind our action. And it turns out that all of us are actually wired to move away from discomfort. And, throughout development, if you're face to face with a lion, for example, your brain is designed to protect you, goes on fight, flight, or freeze, and you get yourself out of that. It turns out that the brain is really smart, but when it comes to a protection mechanism, it's sort of stupid. It does not know how to differentiate a real threat, a lion, an ambulance coming towards you, versus a perceived threat. Let me give you an example. How many of us, and just if you're willing, just you can share on the chat, but how many of us have gotten an email that really upsets us? I imagine that has happened to you.
Yes.
Right? And so when that email comes, the brain then immediately, without us having any power over this, goes on and it goes fight, flight, or freeze. And there's 3 responses that we can have that I call the 3 R's of avoidance. Some of us, me included, when something presses my button, I react. I go towards discomfort with the function of eliminating it. So what does that look like for that email? I type an email so fast. And I literally, I'm not thinking clearly, because when the amygdala is on, the prefrontal cortex is out for lunch. And this just happened to me. I was in a plane about to take off. I got this email. It upset me. So I screenshot it, sent to my husband, and I text him I can't believe this. Before he even responded to me, I was typing the response. My husband goes, do not respond to this email. It's avoidance. So I actually react to avoid. Some of us retreat. You get that email and you go, oh, that upset me. And then you take your phone out and you go on social media, you walk away and go get a glass of water. You're basically moving away to calm yourself down. And some of us remain, and that is the frozen response. You are staring at that computer screen. You don't know what to do, but your brain's just frozen. So basically, psychological avoidance then is our response to perceived threat to make us feel better, either by reacting, retreating, or remaining. And it happens everywhere in our lives. It happens when we go on a date with somebody new. It happens when, a coworker gives us a look and we interpret that look to mean something. And then we might, say something mean, or we might walk away. And those are some examples that paint enough of a color.
Yes, I love the react, retreat, and what was the last R?
Remain.
So when you were saying that, I was thinking, using the email example, for some of us, we can just see the email address and not even get to the content of what is in the email. And that can also trigger that fight, flight, or freeze in us. And I think it speaks to the relationship between feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, and who we are talking to. Do you find that individuals have a tendency to react differently or go to a different avoidance technique depending on their situation and who they may be interacting with?
So context is going to matter significantly. And I love that you elevated this, because you're right. Sometimes you don't even have to read the email. Right. I mean, I had an example that somebody, I was on a phone call, and then another call came in, and it was somebody that I've had a history of conflict with. And my heart just skipped that. I was like, I didn't even talk to the person. Right? I just saw the name on my phone. And immediately I had that response. And so I think context definitely matters. But I think you actually even elevated to another point, which is for us to be able to understand our own flavor of avoidance. One of the things that I suggest is that we learn to really pause. And whenever we have that fight, flight, or freeze response, and most of us know how it feels, right? The heart pounds, we may sweat, our stomach aches, we tense up. When that happens, I suggest, and I talk about this as our hidden superpower in Bold and Move, that we pause on what I call the thoughts, emotions, and behaviors cycle. So really writing down, to your point, writing down when that phone call came, what did I say to myself? How did that make me feel? What did I want it to do? Because for us to be able to understand our avoidance, we first have to pause and understand what is it's going on in our brain? How do we feel? Without knowing that, we cannot change our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors.
I love that. And can you share with our audience, what are some of the physical traits that may show up when we are in that avoidance space, reacting to a particular situation?
So if we're talking specifically about react, right? I'll back up before we even talk about any of the R's of avoidance. What happens is once the amygdala gets activated and our brain is on fight, flight, or freeze, what we know scientifically is that our thinking brain really is offline a little bit. And so we are all in protection system, and we are here to sort of make sure that we are safe, and we make to safety. And so what happens is in milliseconds, your heart starts to pound. And why does that happen? Well, you need a lot more blood circulating. Blood comes out of your brain to your extremities, so you can tense up and you can fight if you have to. That's why we get dizziness. That's why we get increased heart pound. We get change in our vision, so we can hyper focus. And because there's a lot more blood circulating, our heart's pounding faster, our temperature goes high, but the brain is very smart. So then we start to sweat, to cool off, to make sure we're not frying off our brains. And those are some of the symptoms, sensations that people will notice immediately. And the difference is when there is a real threat, we don't interpret those sensations as bad. So if you are crossing a street with your kid, an ambulance comes suddenly running, you get to safety and you go, it's okay. But in the case of seeing the subject line of the email, your heart pounds the same way. It's the same mechanism. But now to you, or at least to me, it feels like it comes out of nowhere. And then we go, why is my heart pounding? What's wrong with me? And just that thought activates more of that physiology. And now we're spinning on our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors.
I love that. I love that answer. And I love that you're able to make it so simplistic, because I think there are situations when we feel certain things and we know certain things. But as you were mentioning, depending on the setting and the context of when we're experiencing this particular situation, it has a very different reaction. And that leads me to a really important question and a distinguishing factor. what do you feel are the differences between anxiety and avoidance? And the reason I ask that question is that as we matriculate and grow in the mental health world and it becomes more accepting in our society, there are certain buzzwords that we hear a lot. We hear anxiety, we hear avoidance. And I want to make sure that our attendees know, like, and our listeners, what are the differences between these things? How do I know if I'm having anxiety versus if this is just something that I may be avoiding?
Great question. And I almost think there's a spectrum here to help all of us. So I think about anxiety through the thoughts, emotions, and behavior cycles. And the reason I do is because you're right. We have, as a society, we're like, oh, what's anxiety? And a lot of time when we're talking about anxiety, people are talking about their physical sensations of anxiety. So my heart's pounding, I feel uncomfortable, I'm sweating, I'm trembling, and cold flashes. So there's one experience of anxiety that we have. But for a lot of people I've worked with in the world, when they start to feel uncomfortable, sometimes it's their thinking. It's really catastrophizing, predicting the worst, predicting that something bad's going to happen and they can't handle it. Now, that kind of prediction tends to, of course, make you feel more uncomfortable. But for them, they enter the anxiety cycle more in the thinking. For some people, they don't even get to that anxiety sensations or feelings because they are literally just avoiding anything that makes them uncomfortable, right? So, and anxiety goes from very mild to, an anxiety disorder. Now we're talking about a host of symptoms. So if we're talking about social anxiety disorder, for example, which I could have developed had my grandmother not intervened, we're talking about people that are afraid of being evaluated negatively by others, thinking that people are going to make fun of them. They'll have some of the same sensations, but the focus of fear here is negative evaluation from others. So anxiety and our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, there's a spectrum of it from mild to moderate to severe. A host of symptoms leads to what's known as an anxiety disorder. And then what's avoidance? Well, I coined the term psychological avoidance because psychological avoidance is what we do when we feel anxiety. No matter if it's thinking, no matter if it's feeling, right? It's our response to anxiety. And I have to tell you all, anxiety is not the problem. The problem is what we do, because what we do is we avoid. And unfortunately, what we're doing is we are training our brain that we can't handle it. So you're terrified of giving a presentation. You don't give a presentation. And then you're like, see, I couldn't do it. I was yesterday in Las Vegas at a conference, and right before I was presenting, one of my co-presenters was feeling really anxious. She's like, do I take my phone with me? So I have all my notes. And I looked at her and I said, I don't think you should, because I want you to learn that you can do without that phone. And in the last minute, she left the phone. And in the end, she said, wow, that was so much better than I thought it was going to be. Right? We're predicting, and she could have done a subtle form of avoidance. It wouldn't have been bad. People go with their phones all the time. But what I wanted her to experience is that if she chose to approach instead of avoiding, she's training her brain. And the next time she gives a presentation, there's a little piece of data that goes, maybe I can do it. And that's the difference between anxiety and avoidance. Avoidance is the problem. Anxiety is what I think is our fever, right? It's the thing that we focus on. But what we should be focusing on is avoidance.
How can a person recognize thinking patterns that have them tense, anxious, and worried?
So I would again recommend what I call the thoughts, emotions, and behavior cycle. Now, this is classic cognitive behavior therapy. In CBT, this is called the cognitive triad, right? Which is what you're saying to yourself affects how you feel affects what you do. The reason I call it the TAB cycle, thoughts, emotions, and behavior cycle, is because it's easy to remember. And what we need to do is whenever we sense discomfort, take a pause, just a pause, and literally write down what you're saying to yourself. And this is not a edited version, right? If there's the presentation, you're probably saying things like, I'm going to mess up. People are going to laugh at me. I'm never going to be able to do this. When you say to yourself, I'm going to mess up, how do you feel? I feel anxious. I feel scared. I feel afraid. And what do you want to do? I don't want to do the presentation. Now, why is it important? And I know this is something that CBT therapists talk a ton about, but But what is the function of actually writing this down? Well, the idea here is to activate our thinking brain. And remember that I said, whenever we are on that fight, flight, or freeze, we are in the amygdala with the emotional brain. When the emotional brain is on, the thinking brain is less active. So if we're going to change and understand what's happening on those catastrophic thoughts, we need to activate the thinking brain. One way to do it is literally to write it down. And I still practice it to this day. Whenever there's a moment that my anxiety spikes in the middle of the day, I go, wait a minute, let me look at what's behind the curtain to help me slow down my brain before I can change.
Do you find, Dr. Marquez, that those can be interchangeable? Can it be that you feel something, then you think something, then you do something? Or do you find that the thought is there, which triggers the feeling, which then triggers the behavior? Are those interchangeable?
Great question. Thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are like a ping pong table that goes really fast. And the entryway, it will change for most people. Sometimes you're working, this happened to me, writing Bold Move, for example. There were moments when my brain would go blank and it was really thinking, oh my God, people are going to hate this book. I can't believe I'm writing a book. They're going to make fun of me. What if I share this experience of having panic attacks as a kid? What are people going to think of me professionally? And those thoughts would make me feel very anxious. And often I'd get up from the computer and try to go have a toast or something to avoid those thoughts. Sometimes it's literally physiology. You know, I've had experience when I'm sitting here and then my heart just skipped a beat and you go, wait a minute, what happened here? And so it actually is less relevant, our entryway. It's more important for all of us to learn that once you're spinning in a negative cycle of what you're saying to yourself, how you feel and what you do, you're spinning. And it goes really fast. That's why, again, I recommend that we write it, because that's how we slow it down and we get to see what's feeding it. Sometimes what's feeding it is distorted thoughts. Sometimes it's really that we can't tolerate our own body sensations. And by learning that, then we can learn to break the cycle.
Thank you. You mentioned early in your introduction that you've worked in mental health for quite some time and you've worked in a variety of settings, but I did want to ask you specifically, how do these behaviors typically manifest with regards to disordered eating, and what do providers and people impacted need to be aware of?
So I'll answer that question with the caveat that I am not an eating disorder expert. I am an anxiety expert, or these days an avoidance expert, I should say. But I've worked with a lot of individuals that have had disordered eating. And, I think the mechanism that we are talking about shows up the same way, which is there is an avoidance of inability to tolerate what you're feeling and a decision to sort of divorce from your feelings, right? By restricting, for example, or binging, but there's this avoidance behind it. And what I've seen with a lot of disordered eating is that anxiety is one of those things that trigger it, so that they feel really anxious and then they engage in whatever behavior they have that's behind the disordered eating, and that can really starts in a loop. And so sometimes my colleagues who are incredible eating disorder experts send somebody to me and say, can we just teach this person avoidance and bringing anxiety down? Because what we've seen is if we can do that, we also are actually addressing some of the disordered eating. And quite honestly, the protocols to treating most of the eating disorders as well as anxiety disorders are very parallel. So we're teaching similar strategies with a focus sometimes on eating, sometimes on anxiety. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yes, that does answer the question. And how does avoidance influence our approach to seeking care, support, and help?
So because avoidance works momentarily, it always works. So you wake up, you're feeling a little anxious, you call a friend, or you don't do your email and you procrastinate by cleaning the house, for example, some productive procrastination. So avoidance, because it always works, sometimes it prolongs people's decision to seek help because they keep saying to themselves, it's okay, it's okay. Now, I've worked with individuals, for example, who had a long history of trauma that just white knuckle through life because they avoided so much that they're like, I can handle it. I can handle it. I can handle it. And the problem is the infection gets deeper and deeper. It doesn't go away. And so I think one way that avoidance gets in the way of seeking care is, again, just prolonging. And we have some data on this that, in mental health, sometimes the gap between having symptoms and seeking treatment can be up to 17 years. And for some disorders, 27 years. So somebody's suffering. And I think avoidance is one of the mechanisms that keep people suffering in silence.
I agree with you. I think when we avoid in some way, we think that we are protecting ourselves. And if we act as if something is not there, then magically it will disappear. But I think we know that it is the complete opposite, that it can only be avoided for so long until it comes to the surface.
That's such a great. Oh, sorry. That's such a great insight. Fantastic, because you're right. I think about this often as facing reality does not mean we like reality. But the first step on change is facing whatever it is that we're dealing with. And if we don't, we keep doing the same thing, expecting a different outcome. I think that's the definition of insanity. But we have to do it. We have to face reality.
We have to. And then I have a question here. It says, what are some of the most common reasons people avoid seeking support for trauma or other mental health issues, especially in the communities you serve?
So in the communities of color and in inner city, which is a lot of my work, but what I'm going to say, actually, I'm going to slice it between communities and then I'll go to a meta level. But, within the Latino community, for example, I personally did not understand that domestic violence was trauma until I got to the US. My father and my mother had lots of incidents of domestic violence, so had several of my friends. And so within the culture I grew up, that kind of trauma was just standard. Another example, somebody being held at gunpoint. It was like, oh, it happens. And because it happens does not mean that it doesn't have a traumatic effect. So there is a stigma and there is a misconception of what's trauma within some communities. Then, I've seen this a lot in the organizations I worked with in the US, the fear specifically for some women that if they were to say this, then something bad would happen. And so that you'd get worse. And in the case of domestic violence, there is some data that suggests that could be the case if you don't actually help somebody be safe before they're out of traumatic experience. And so there's stigma. There's this misconception of what's trauma versus not trauma. Right? And then the other piece about trauma that is for anyone is this idea that from a traumatic event to developing post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's important to say, not everyone that has a traumatic event will go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. After the marathon bombings here in Boston, I saw hundreds of people right away. And a small percentage I eventually had to treat. But in the first month, what you're trying to teach somebody, something really bad happened. Here are the things you need to do to go back to a status quo for you. But for those that go on to develop PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, there is this belief that it was my fault. I did something wrong. If I hadn't drank too much, I wouldn't have been raped. If I had driven more carefully, this car wouldn't have hit me. If I had just seen that come, I could have prevented it. And this belief that's my fault comes with such shame, comes with such fear that I think a lot of people are terrified to even ask for help. And I'll add one more piece here because I know we have providers amongst ourselves. There's two entryways I see this. One is the level of the patient who has shame and has fear or minimizes the trauma, so they won't ask for help. They won't tell you. The other one is I've trained a lot of providers to treat PTSD, and a lot of them have their own beliefs about, well, if I asked about this, I'm making them feel uncomfortable. If I ask about this trauma, then I'm making them suffer more. And I'm going to tell you, if somebody has a traumatic experience, they are thinking about it all the time. As a provider, what you're doing is empowering them to find their voice and to get care. And so we are not making them worse by asking, and we're certainly not making the trauma worse by addressing it. the opposite is actually true. And so I find that there's an intersection at the patient and provider level. And I urge all of us to really manage our own discomfort so that we can approach these conversations with our clients.
Wonderful answer. I do have a question for you. You mentioned early on in the conversation the impact that your grandmother had on you and your cultural impact with how things were perceived and the norms in your culture. How has it been with you going back with this education, this research, and this evidence? Have you been well received in your community with mental health?
That's a wonderful question. Yes, I think I have. Going back home in particular, and I'll know more about this because Bold Move comes out in Portuguese in a month. So we'll see how the Brazilian community thinks about it. But, I created many good colleagues in Brazil and South America and that really respect my work and the journey. And I have to say, at Harvard, and in particular in my department in psychiatry, I think once I found my voice and I was able to say things like, when you talk to me this way, this is what I hear. Is this what you intend to say? When I was able to say to my boss, listen, I think this is discrimination and I'm not okay with it. I had a particular incident that a male colleague who had less credentials that I had was offered $10,000 more than I was for the same job. And I was like, that's not okay. And so once I was able to be able to have those tough conversations and really embrace for myself the full part of my identity, then I think I showed up much better. And I think the system then accommodated it much better.
I think that was an example of you making a bold move.
Because it was very uncomfortable, I have to say. But, being bold is not being fearless. Being bold is living a value-driven life. And it's hard to do, but it's so worth it.
So worth it. And one thing I would add, as an African-American woman and a licensed professional counselor, I facilitate our BIPOC group here at Within, and really bringing into the space a safe place for clients who identify in these particular communities to be able to talk about how culture and how their ethnicity has impacted their relationships with food, their relationships with other people, their relationships in the workplace has been something that has been very rewarding. And I find that the work you are doing is remarkable. And just having you here and having this conversation has been so helpful to me. So I know that extends to everyone that we are touching and who is listening to us today. I did want to give you an opportunity to share how our attendees can find you on your social media platforms.
Thank you, Jamie. And it's really been a pleasure. You're such a great moderator. And before I talk about the social media, I think the conversations about our identity and race and ethnicity and how all of that plays into our profession and our lives in general is so important. So thank you for doing that within your role and leading that such important work and hard work. So I don't want to minimize. So for all of you, you can find me across all social media at Dr. Luana Marques. I think we're staff is putting on the chat already. My website is www.drluana.com. And I love engaging with folks. So if you have questions, if you want to talk, feel free to send me an email at drluana at drluana@drluana.com. It's just such a privilege to be here.
Thank you so much. And just to remind everyone, we have the next few days are going to be full of lots of wonderful presentations. We're going to be doing CE presentations starting tomorrow. We're going to have more wonderful talks this afternoon. Always refer to your CEO dashboard for what is happening next and how to get any of the materials associated with any of our sessions. Again, on behalf of myself and the Within Health team, we want to thank you so much, Dr. Luana, for taking the time to spend with us this afternoon, talking about your book, and we hope to stay connected with you in the future.
Thank you so much, Jamie and Within, and everybody that showed up today. Let's make sure, given that's World Mental Health Day, that we're taking care of our brains. That's the last thing I'll say. I urge you to make a bold move that makes you feel good today.
And don't forget, we will be giving away the bold move to some lucky attendees today. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the summit. Have a good
Thank you.
day.
Bye.
Bye.